Okay, so last month, the Institute for Safe Medication Practices released their annual report on 2017 adverse events that were reported to the FDA. Let's see what else. We've brought on our very first show sponsor, and I seem to owe everyone an apology. Yep, that's all going down today on episode number 25 of Overprescribed. Welcome to Overprescribed, the show that raises America's awareness on pharmaceutical medications in this country, all in an effort to help you, the everyday consumer, to live the safest, healthiest, and most informed medication experience possible. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Overprescribed. I'm your host, Mika Pollock, and last week, we did not release a single new episode. So if you're wondering whether or not the weekly episode from last week downloaded properly onto your phone, well, it wasn't your phone's fault, and it wasn't even the fault of whatever podcast app you listen to hear the Overprescribed show. It was actually our fault. We just didn't release one. So for that, I apologize. But we're back this week and we're talking about something I have been waiting to discuss. And now I finally have a chance to. Because it's the annual report from the folks over at the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, or the ISMP, and they finally released one last month. Now, you may recall me mentioning this nonprofit back in one of our earlier episodes. I think it was either episode number 4 or 5. But anyway, they release these quarterly reports called Quarter Watch, and those tend to focus on what they're seeing and assessing from the FDA MedWatch reports, which are basically the FDA data system of reports of all the adverse drug reactions that they receive every day, all year long, regardless of whether or not those adverse drug reactions relate to a suspected link between a drug and a particular negative health outcome, or if the report is being made on a confirmed reporting of an adverse drug reaction that was linked to a drug. And I like these reports from the ISMP for two key reasons. For one, I love these reports because they are taking data that we can basically all pull from the FDA. The FDA has this data available on their public website, and you can pull files of these reports. And basically, the ISMP, they're offering their own free expertise on what they think this means for everyone to digest and understand. And two, I like these reports because they really offer a snapshot into a world that most everyday consumers are not really in tune with. We just don't get the information. Yet we are very much in tune with going to the doctors, getting a prescription, and taking whatever medicine we're prescribed, and just attempting to go along on our merry little way, without realizing that there are drugs, commonly prescribed drugs at that may cause harm to your body. And what's really scary is not just the probability of that happening to you or someone in your family based on taking X drug or X compilation of drugs, but you or your healthcare provider may not even realize that you're experiencing something or some things that were caused by the drug you took. And that's just one serious underlying concern that I have about medication use in America. But again, I just love these reports because they really provide some valuable insight. Now, in this annual report, I'm talking about the Quarter Watch annual report, the team that produces these reports were able to report out that there was a grand total of 1,211,683 new adverse drug event reports. So slightly over 1 million, 1.2 million, I'll say. And this was slightly over a 2% increase from last year. So last year's annual Quarter Watch report. But it was a whopping 83.1% increase from 5 years ago. Now, I'm going to get into the details of this report in a second. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about our very first show sponsor. Have you ever wanted to go green? Would you love to support a family in need? Now, what if I told you you could do both by buying a pair of Superfly kicks? That's right, Vita Shoes is a startup brand dedicated to improving the world around them while offering affordable, dope sneakers made mostly from recycled and organic material. And the Overprescribed podcast is proud to partner with them this month because throughout the month of October, Vita Shoes is running a campaign to support the creation of a housing center where cancer patients and their families can stay for free. And if you head over to vitashoes.com/hope, buy a pair of kicks today or anytime this month, enter the discount code PRESCRIBED, PRESCRIBED, at checkout for 10% off your purchase. Well, for every pair sold, $10 will go towards their $1,000 donation goal that they're trying to reach this month. If sneakers aren't your thing, well, purchase a Vita shirt and they'll donate $5 from each of those purchases. Either way, it's October and Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so I hope you can find it in your heart to support this amazing cause and especially a brand like Vita Shoes. Again, head on over to vitashoes.com/hope and enter the discount code PRESCRIBED at checkout for 10% off. I personally own a pair of these shoes and I love them because they're lightweight, comfortable, and I always get compliments. So head on over to check them out, vitashoes.com/hope. Okay, so as I was saying before that quick break there, the FDA 2017 Adverse Event Reporting System had a total of 1.2 million estimated new adverse drug event reports. This isn't in the report here, but I just want to remind everyone that this is 1.2 million reports that came in out of 4 billion prescriptions, 4 billion plus prescriptions that were apparently written in 2017. So the amount of reports that came in pales in comparison to the number of prescriptions. And what that means really is up for personal interpretation. But what I'm trying to get is that every drug has a side effect. Every drug has adverse drug reactions. And, there's only a report on 1.2 million of them out of 4 billion prescriptions written. But anyway, back to the report here. According to the Quarter Watch report authors, the reports identified 1,731 primary suspect drugs, but the number for reports for each drug ranged from as few as one case, which amounted to 122 drugs, to more than 10,000 cases, which amounted to 17 drugs. There was also multiple factors that influence the number of adverse event reports. This includes the toxicity profile of the drug, the number of patients who've been exposed to the drug, and the educational and marketing activities of drug manufacturers, which may cause them to learn of more adverse drug events they're required to report. So again, something I mentioned back in episode 4 or 5, or maybe even other episodes as well, is that it's not mandatory for consumers, patients, patient family members, or even healthcare providers to report suspected or confirmed adverse drug reactions to the FDA, but it is mandatory for manufacturers to report that to the FDA within their normal course of business. The report goes on to state that the 2017 total includes 309,641 foreign cases, which is about 25.5% of the 1.2 adverse drug events reported for 2017, submitted by manufacturers who also market the U.S. approved drugs abroad. Now, in this annual report, which I promise to include a link in the show notes so you can read it yourself or access it to check out any particular sections yourself, it looks like the report authors decided to focus on 4 adverse events that they were able to examine from the FDA's 2017 data. And I thought it was a very good look at these 4 particular events because they're not very common occurrences that, a lot of us may even hear about or know about unless you work in healthcare or you've experienced this personally. And so I thought it was really good to talk about it because this allows you to think, and to be more aware as you're taking medication or your loved ones are taking medication to say, you know what, this may have been what your experience. It could be linked to these things that are not very common, by the way, but they can happen. Or there's different variations of commonality, but some of these things are very low in probability of occurrence. So let's get into some of the details on those events. There were 4 adverse events. The first one is something called rhabdomyolysis. And I've heard of this before, particularly as it relates to an adverse drug reaction with particular pharmaceutical medications. But they pointed this one out as the number 1 here on their list of 4. According to the report, this disorder occurs when drugs directly or indirectly damage or destroy skeletal muscle cells, which then release such large quantities of cellular proteins that they overwhelm the kidney's filtering capacity to remove them. Notably, this is the most extreme subset of the spectrum of muscle damage induced by therapeutic drugs. Number 2 on their list was serotonin syndrome or neuroleptic malignant syndrome. They're 2 different things, but they're on the same bullet here, and it's for specific reasons that we'll get into in a moment. But in serotonin syndrome, according to the report, an overdose or combination of drugs that increase the levels of this neurotransmitter produces a rapid onset of abnormal behavior and thought, muscle spasms, and compromises of the autonomic nervous system. With regards to neuroleptic malignant syndrome, this is largely similar, except that drugs blocking dopamine receptors trigger the syndrome, and the abnormal muscle contractions are described as lead pipe rigidity. Now, the third one on their list of 4 was something that as soon as I read it, I said, aha, I had a feeling this was going to be on here, because this one, just like rhabdomyolysis, is the only condition that I've ever heard linked to a pharmaceutical medication before. And it was the first time that I heard about it. But it's very serious, and it's called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. They have a slash for also calling it toxic epidermal necrolysis. And they have it that way for a reason. We'll get into the specifics about that as well. They're very much related. But Stevens-Johnson syndrome also goes by SJS, and toxic epidermal necrolysis goes by TEN or 10. According to the report, in this disorder, the body's immune system attacks and destroys the skin, producing a condition similar to severe burns. The difference between SJS and TEN is the extent of body surface area affected. So when someone has Stevens-Johnson syndrome, that's limited to less severe cases where less than 10% of the body surface is compromised. So once the body surface is compromised to a certain higher percentage degree, then the person is diagnosed with toxic epidermal necrolysis. And then the fourth adverse event that they kind of focused on here was something called progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy. It goes by the abbreviation PML. According to the report, this is an often fatal viral infection of the brain that occurs when immunosuppressive drugs compromise the body's ability to hold a widely prevalent virus in check. Antibody studies indicate that the virus, or John Cunningham virus, or JCV, can be found in 50 to 70% of the adult population. But both the initial infection and the later latency are without symptoms until immune compromise allows the virus to attack and destroy the white matter of the brain. And I think for me, in reading that description about PML, again, that's progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, what stuck out to me most was the fact that in 50 to 70% of the adult population, antibodies can be found in those persons as it relates to JCV. And there's more detail about this one here in the report that I thought was very interesting, and we'll point that out as well. But this report from Quarter Watch is one I think that deserves some good attention because it allows us to really understand a little bit more about not only what's being reported to the FDA, but what are some of the likelihoods of certain drugs when it comes to certain outcomes. There's common features as well that the report authors wanted to point out. So on page 2 of the report, while common adverse drug events, for example, nausea, have many causes, in all conditions of interest, drugs are by far the most prominent cause. Unlike many adverse events, these conditions are rarely confounded by signs and symptoms of the underlying medical problem being treated. Some overlap occurs between these disorders. The uncontrolled muscle contractions of neuroleptic malignant syndrome can cause damage so severe that rhabdomyolysis also ensues. Meanwhile, some psychiatric drugs affect both serotonin and dopamine neurotransmitters and can contribute to both syndromes or make them difficult to distinguish. And so that's a very important paragraph here in the report too, because it's really telling us that not only do these things occur, and my assumption is that the predictability, and I think it's kind of confirmed in the literature, the predictability of this occurrence in individual persons is hard to determine. But also there's overlap. And I think when there's overlap between conditions and when one condition can lead to another condition, it leads to a complicated manner in which people can be medically treated. And it leads to a complication when it comes to people or healthcare providers being able to detect and actually narrow down what exactly is causing a problem for someone and what do they have. And when I mean what do they have, I mean the symptoms, because we're going to get into some of these, into these serious adverse drug events that they're pointing out here in the report in a moment. But when you look at some of the symptoms related to those, it may not be uncommon, I guess, depending on when someone appears with some of these symptoms, whether it's within a few hours or within a few days, and whether they have 3 of the known 9 symptoms or not 4 of the 9 known symptoms. I think it really can become complicated and actually very difficult to detect and to determine what someone has and how to treat them. The authors point out also that the incidence is unknown in some ways. So a specific quote here says, "These severe adverse events share with many other harms of therapeutic drugs the limitation that their true rate of occurrence is unknown, and thus the 4,631 reported cases in 2017 do not provide reliable insights into how frequently they may occur in exposed patients." The Quarter Watch case count for 2017 is shown in Table 1. Although the number of unreported cases is unknown, these events are relatively uncommon, at least in these severe forms. So also here on page 2, there's a table. It's titled Cases Report to the FDA of 4 Severe Drug Adverse Events for 2017. And it tells us exactly how many cases for the 4 serious adverse drug events that they're going to focus on in this report came about. So, for example, for rhabdomyolysis, it looks like there was about 1,549 cases with a 12% mortality rate. For serotonin or neuroleptic malignant syndrome, there was 1,485 cases, or an 11% mortality rate. Stevens-Johnson syndrome or toxic epidural necrolysis had a 1,178 number of cases with an 18% mortality rate, so higher than the previous 2 events mentioned. And then last but not least, in this table, it mentions progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy with the lowest number out of all 4, with a total number of 419 cases, but the greatest mortality rate of all at 29%. Okay, there are some disclaimers to make about the interpretation of the data, and the Quarter Watch team does want to point that out here in their report as well. So, according to the authors, their findings should be interpreted in light of the known limitations of a reporting system that does not collect data systematically. The submission of an individual report does not in itself establish that the suspect drug caused the event described, only that an observer suspected a relationship. While the sheer numbers of case reports have scientific weight because of variation in reporting rates, they reveal little about how frequently the events occur in the broader patient population. More complete disclaimers and descriptions of our criteria are included in the methods and summary section of this report. A disclosure statement expands our description of this project and the staff. So I wanted to read that just because I think when we look at the data, we look at the interpretations, we have to take some of it with a grain of salt because there are limitations to the system. Again, the FDA does not mandate reporting from all parties, all stakeholders in the medication spectrum. They're only mandating reports sent into them from drug manufacturers. They're not mandating reports from consumers and healthcare providers. Meanwhile, there's this difference between suspected causality and confirmed causality. And what many people don't even realize is that a lot of times confirming causality may largely be subjective. There may be laboratory diagnostic tests to back up, for example, some particular kidney or liver damage and some kind of temporality linkage between when a drug was taken and when someone expressed a certain negative health outcome. But there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into determining causality. And that causality largely hinges on expert medical advice in clinical practice and evidence-based research that also shows data that backs up a particular type of causality. But I think still the weight of the annual report is incredible. It is noteworthy and it should be paid attention to. Thank you for listening to another episode of Overprescribed. Tune in next week for part 2 of our discussion on this annual report from the Quarter Watch team over at ISMP. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at _overprescribed. Again, that's at _overprescribed. If you have a particular question for us, feel free to email us at talk@overprescribedpodcast.com. Again, that's talk@overprescribedpodcast.com. And you can also check us out on Facebook at the Overprescribed Podcast.